Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the different types of graduate programs and a little bit about how to figure out what the right one for you is. I do want to make a couple of standard caveats on this because my training is in English literature in the United States. The things that I'm going to be saying about different types of graduate programs will apply primarily to the humanities and the arts. There are going to definitely be differences in the hard sciences and the social sciences in the way that graduate programs may be organized, what's involved in them, etc., etc. I don't know enough about those fields to really talk usefully about them. So the comments that I'm going to make, again, will be about English, history, comparative religion, classics, the fine arts, painting, sculpture, graphic design, theater, creative writing, these kinds of disciplines. And this is, again, based in the US higher education system. Other countries have different approaches, different organizations to higher education. But in the US, there's some things that are pretty standard across the board. So that's going to be what I'm talking about here. So first off, what is graduate school? If you're an undergrad, chances are you have had people talk to you about graduate school, or at least mention graduate school. You may or may not have a good sense of exactly what it is. Basically, graduate school is continuing your education beyond the bachelor's degree, right? So the basic 4-year course, usually 4 years here in the US, is you get a bachelor's degree. Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Science being the two most common. To specialize more in your discipline. And the thing is, most people who come out of undergrad universities with a bachelor's degree they often don't get jobs necessarily in their field. So if you really want to specialize, and if you're a biochemistry major and you really want to be a biochemist and do like top tier work in research labs or something like that, the bachelor's is not regarded as sufficient training to do that. It's just not, the level is not high enough. And that's essentially what graduate school is for. It's for people who are particularly specializing in their field and going beyond the sort of broad-based education typically provided by undergrad. So there's a number of different types of graduate programs. For most people, for most disciplines, the basic graduate program, the first thing that you would enter is a master's program. This is often a 2-year program, though there's some variations on this. Basically, the master's is largely a continuation of the bachelor's, but at a higher degree of difficulty and a little bit more sort of narrowly focused. So graduate school, unlike bachelor's degrees in the US, graduate schools are not going to have general education requirements. So if you're going to grad school for English literature, for instance, you're not going to have to take sciences, you're not going to have to take Econ 101, you're not going to have to take any of those general education courses. You're going to be focused on literature courses and maybe some related courses. So like you might, depending on how your program is set up, be able to take a course in history or psychology or some other related discipline if you can make a case for how that will benefit your studies in your program. So but for the most part, again, you're focused on the thing that you are there to do. If you are going into a master's program for classics, you are focused on classics. You are focused on ancient literature. You're focused on ancient philosophy. You're focused on ancient theology, mythology, etc., etc. That's what you're doing. And typically these are organized. These are not necessarily the same kind of classes you likely encountered in undergrad, especially if you went to a large university where you had a lot of lecture classes. Graduate classes are much more likely to be seminar style, which basically means a much smaller group of people, and you are on the hook for actively engaging, contributing to discussion, and having insights about the work that you are considering. So that's much more central to graduate school. You're also typically going to be writing longer papers. Exams and quizzes and things like that are going to be a lot less common in most graduate programs. Essays are going to be much more important as you move toward becoming professional scholars or practitioners in these disciplines. So that's going to be another big difference. The master's program, again, is typically a 2-year program. There's a few different ways that a master's program may wrap up. Usually there's some sort of closing component to it. At the master's program I went through at University of Vermont, there were 2 different options, and I think these are 2 fairly standard options. There was either comps, which was a set of, they're called comprehensive exams, basically, but they're not exams in the sense of like you're getting multiple choice and fill in the blank and all that stuff. It is basically timed essays that you write on particular topics based on preparatory research that you've done. The other option was a master's thesis, which was an extended research paper, fairly long, usually, maybe around 30 pages, as much as 50 pages in some instances. And basically you do an extended analysis of a particular topic, and you prove that you have mastery of the skills that this discipline requires. So that's the master's program. It's the sort of gateway program, introductory program. If you are interested in specializing in your discipline, but you're not sure that this is the thing that you want to commit to for your life, the master's program is a good way to go. It gives you a sense of what professional scholarship, professional practice in that field is going to look like without sort of committing you in the way that a PhD program does. So that's why you would tend to choose a master's program. A master's program is also often a transitional program. So a lot of people who are in an MA program will intend to go on to a PhD, but not everybody does. A lot of people just get their MA and then leave higher education at that point and go do work in the field, things like this. An MA does open up more doors than just a bachelor's, but it doesn't specialize you, and the PhD can risk closing some doors. Sometimes people don't want to hire PhDs outside of academia or outside of that professional field because they're viewed as too specialized. So the MA is kind of in the sweet spot there. So that's one program. The other version of a master's is the MFA, which is the Master of Fine Arts. This is for people in the arts, broadly conceived. So that would be, again, the fine arts, painting, sculpture, graphic design, things like this. Also, people in theater, whether that's acting, directing, dance, music, tech stuff, props, set design, lighting, any of those kinds of things, or creative writing, poetry, fiction, creative nonfiction, drama, any of these things. The arts tend to artists tend to go more for MFA programs, which are often slightly longer. They're very typically 3 years long rather than the 2-year long MA. The MFA is more toward a PhD side in that the MFA is considered a terminal degree. A master's is not considered a terminal degree, which means that in theory, the master's is a stepping stone to the PhD. The PhD is a terminal degree because that's the last degree that you would be expected to get in that sequence of your education. The MFA is the same thing. It is considered the last degree that artists would be expected to get in the normal course of pursuing higher education in the arts. Again, you've got the same kind of setup that you have with a master's, where the coursework is very focused on your particular discipline. There's going to be much more of an emphasis on producing a final project of whatever kind is appropriate for that discipline. So a final portfolio of paintings, for instance, or a final portfolio of art photography, something like that. Maybe this is directing a performance, whatever it is. Typically, an MFA program builds you toward a masterpiece, a master project. And that's the way that you sort of finish through your MFA, is by proving that you have developed the skills required for functioning professionally in this discipline. There is a DFA, which is a Doctor of Fine Arts. My sense is that this is a program some schools have created but hasn't really taken off, in part because the MFA serves its function perfectly well. The DFA is a more in-depth version, but in some fields it may have more value. But in my experience, from what I've seen, for most artists, the MFA is the thing that you would be expected to have if you have a graduate degree. So that's the MFA. That's another option. If you're in the arts, that would be the program you want to look into. And then the other major branch of the graduate school is the PhD, the doctorate. And this is a much more in-depth, much more rigorous process. Typically, you would come to a PhD program out of a master's or sometimes an MFA, depending on exactly what path you're taking. But the doctorate involves, usually, it's hard to say because different doctoral programs have different lengths that they expect things to take. My doctoral program at West Virginia University, they recommended that it should be 5 years, but most people took a little bit longer, somewhere between 6 and 7. In part, that was because we tended to have a fairly high teaching load. We tended to teach 2 classes per semester, which is somewhat more than a lot of other places. A lot of places tend to have their graduate teaching assistants teaching 1 course per semester. And doubling that teaching load obviously takes up more of your time that then can't go to graduate studies. But somewhere between 4 and 7 years is probably what you would expect to spend in a PhD program, especially if it comes with a teaching position. And a teaching position can be really useful if you plan to go into academia. So the first portion of a doctoral program will typically be fairly similar to the master's, where you are, again, focused on knowledge within that discipline, focused on different components of that field. The stakes will be higher, the expectations will be higher. There will likely be more emphasis on seminar classes and those very sort of tight discussion-based courses where you have to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of analyzing whatever course material it is. But then the latter portion of the doctorate will be your dissertation. And the dissertation is a multi-stage process during which you essentially produce a book-length project, a book-length analysis of whatever your subject matter is. So over the course of this, there's different requirements, different ways that these things are set up, but typically you have some sort of process in which you find dissertation advisors, or a dissertation advisor and committee members, people who are willing to help you figure out how to actually produce a book-length scholarly work, people who are willing to assess you on how successful you have been, etc., etc. Then you tend to do a formal proposal in which you lay out what this project is going to be about, why it's important, what it contributes to the field, these sorts of questions. Then eventually you move to another set of comps, comprehensive exams. Again, these are timed essays that you write based on the research that you have done, and what kind of resources you're allowed to take into comps varies from program to program. I think in my comps, you could bring one sheet of paper with markings on one side. So you could take like notes, quotes you thought you might need to use based on the subject of that essay, those sorts of things on that one piece of paper. And that was the only resource you were allowed to have, that kind of stuff. Then you move into actually drafting the dissertation itself, and you write a number of chapters, and each chapter obviously needs to be focused. Again, this is basically a scholarly work. And I've done a video before where I've talked to a number of other people, I think 4 or 5 other people, about what goes into writing a dissertation. That video is definitely worth checking out. But that's basically what the PhD program involves. You start with, again, coursework where you specialize in your particular field, and then you produce, over a period of several years, you produce a very focused, professional, scholarly book. That's essentially it. What the PhD is really, really good for doing is establishing you in that discipline. Like, you are now in that field. You are presumably an expert on the subject matter you wrote your dissertation about. Dissertations often get converted into people's first books. That's what I did with mine. And so you are now sort of in that field. One of the problems with that is that if you then want to leave academia, it can actually be a lot harder to get a job outside of academia, because if you are, say, a doctor of literature, people in non-literature based jobs may look at that and say, I'm not really convinced that you want to do the job that I'm trying to hire someone for. So that can work against you. Actually, my former office mate had this sort of issue where he had his doctorate on his resume applying for non-academic jobs, and they weren't coming. And then he took his doctorate off and just had his master's on there, and he found a job. So if you want to be outside of academia, the PhD is risky. But if you want to be in academia, this is a thing that you really, really want. Sorry. You can get university jobs with just a master's. You can definitely get university jobs with an MFA. It is also a terminal degree, again. But usually the type of jobs you can get teaching in universities are going to be lower tier jobs, contingent faculty jobs, adjunct jobs, things like that, lecturer positions, rather than tenure track jobs with comparatively more job security. So you should go into the PhD program if you know that this is really, really what you want to do. If working in a university is really, really what you want to do, that would be the reason to go into a PhD program in the humanities. Again, sciences, it's a little bit different. Sorry. I don't know. I've got a sore throat coming on. Sciences, it's a little bit different. There's a lot of outside lab work, things like that you could do in the sciences, where having that doctorate is going to be beneficial to you. There's not as many sort of outside research labs that are paying people with literature or classics or history degrees to really do literature or classics or history or whatever it is in the field. So it's a little bit different of a setup. So that's basically what I would say about the PhD program. Again, it's much more in-depth, it's a lot more rigorous, it's a lot more challenging than a master's program. And it is the thing that you pursue if you want to be a specialist in the field. Now, there are also combined programs. That's something that you want to be aware of as you're looking out for what master's or what graduate program you might pursue. There are different types of combined programs. Here at Penn State, we have what's called the BAMA program, at least in the English department we do. That's a BA, MA, bachelor's and master's, where essentially you go from the bachelor's program into the master's program. I think it's a 5-year program, if I'm not mistaken. And basically you, in what would be your senior year of undergrad, you transition into taking master's level classes. And then in your 5th year, you're taking master's level classes. You produce your master's thesis or take your comps or whatever it is. And then you get a master's. You still get the bachelor's, but you get a master's at the 5th year. I've heard of this in other places as well, particularly for things like education degrees. I think my cousin got an education degree on this model where in the 5th, you go into a 5th year and then you earn your master's in 1 year rather than going to a separate master's program for 2 years. So that's one thing. If your university offers that, that can really streamline the process. Plus, it's less likely that you have to do a full formal application in the way that you do to graduate school. The other combined program you may encounter is when you go directly into a PhD program from a bachelor's. This is something that you see in more of the Ivy League schools. So Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Brown, these kinds of places. Basically, what happens in those programs is you go into the PhD program, and then about 2 years in, they kind of say, all right, if you want to leave now, we will award you a master's, or you can continue and pursue the PhD. So that's another combined program. Often those places will also offer standalone master's programs, but if you're going into one of those programs, if you're going into an Ivy League school, I think it makes more sense to go into the PhD program. And then if you decide that it's not for you after 2 years, you leave with a master's anyway. It's also much harder to get into an Ivy League school for graduate school, particularly if, like me, you had gone to a small liberal arts college rather than an Ivy League school for undergrad. So that's essentially the kind of the differences in the graduate programs, the reasons you might choose one or the other. I will be doing a video. I don't remember if I mentioned this earlier in this video, but I will be doing another video about how to actually choose a particular graduate school based on your needs, your interests. But this was the first step in determining which graduate school you would want to go to, is just figuring out what you want, which type of graduate program you want to be in.